See. Okay. Hi everyone. I'm Joel Hellman, Dean of the School of Foreign Service. Nice to welcome you all here. Two quick words of apology before I kind of do a quick introduction. One is that I hadn't realized, and Parag, this is his very last moment that he could come to Washington, and we really wanted to get him on campus before he left back to Asia. And we didn't realize, of course, that this is our spring break season. And I thought spring break starts in the weekend, right? So that shouldn't be a problem. But our very, very clever students managed to shave off day after day until spring break really starts on Tuesday instead of Saturday.
Next week, really?
So literally, even though spring break doesn't start yet, we found that all of the events that we've had this week have been affected by the fact that most of the students are actually leaving campus in the minute they can. So apologies to Parag, because I know there'll be a lot of people who'll be interested in this engagement, and I know there are a lot of our students who are really interested in this topic area. But now we're finding that almost all of our events have just the truly committed core who stay on campus, at least through the end. So thank you all for coming for that. And I, because it's the last day, really kind of full day that we're here, I'm going to have to run off and he'll deal with all of the remaining last issues before the university goes into hibernation for spring. Although I think a lot of people are going off to beautiful warm climates for spring break, not me. But it was really important for me to come and just say a word of introduction. First, because I really had encouraged and asked Parag to come here because I think the work he's doing is so important, so interesting, and critical, and I want to be able to expose our community to it. I've been dean now for 3 years, and I've been making the rounds of alumni and engagement, and there are few, I think, who are doing so much in the spirit of the School of Foreign Service than our double alumni. So Parag, as you may know, has a BSFS and a master's degree in SSP, as well as a DPhil, a doctorate degree. Not from us, because we don't offer it here in that School of Foreign Service, and maybe if you did, we'd have you as a triple degree holder. But he is someone steeped in the SFS, and like someone steeped in the SFS. Parag's, I think, strong contribution and Parag's real uniqueness is the breadth and depth and scope of his thinking. And for those of you who've been to even some of the events that we've had this week, you know that I generally always start these events off thinking about this tremendous scope the school has as we face our centennial anniversary, our 100th anniversary this year, and think about how the fact that this was a school designed to grapple with the future of the world order, nothing like less monumental than that. The very future, the shape of the world order, because we were created at a moment in which the world order was being reshaped. If you think about what Parag has been doing in all of his work, and it's an extensive body of work, this is the kind of work that he has been engaged in really thinking deeply about how the world order is shifting and changing, both in terms of technology shifts, in terms of regional changes and regional balance of power issues. So he's thinking in the depth and the scope that really does do justice to everything that we're doing here at SFS. And I think hopefully it was the lessons that you learned and engaged in SFS that are leading. But if you look, I mean, I know now he's going to be talking about his current book, The Future is Asian, which deals with not only Asia itself as a critical power, but the issues that make Asia so important. And from the subtitle of the book, as you can see, commerce, conflict, and culture. In all of those areas, Asia is redefining to some extent the global order. But actually, if you look at his record of publications, a really extraordinarily ambitious scope. His books on the trilogy of the future of the world order, the Second World, Empire's Influence in the Global Order, How to Run the World, Charting a Course to the Next Renaissance, Connectography, which he presented here when the book came out in 2016, Mapping the Future of the Global Civilization. These are the kinds of bold thinking, the kinds of bold analysis that we really think is critical for us going forward, because what we are doing here and what we want to do and animate our next century is to ask these questions, these very questions. How is the world order changing? What are the tectonic shifts and changes that are going to be determining that? What are the regional, cultural, technological, and other issues? So, and that's why I wanted Parag to get back here to talk to you, to present his work, to engage with our community. I know he's going to come back again, so we'll be able to get new opportunities for students and others to hear from him as part of what we're doing. But today, you have an opportunity in a nice small group sort of setting to talk about his latest book, and I thank another double lawyer, Professor Michael Mazarr, who's here to lead that discussion. So two Hoyas, two double Hoyas, quadruple Hoyas, coming here to talk about issues that are really core to where we're going. So thank you very much for being here. It's wonderful to welcome you here. I hope you all have a good discussion. I wish I could hear more, but I'm going to keep talking to Parag more as he comes and joins our campus multiple times, I hope, in the future. So thank you very much. Great to see you here. Thank you for leading the discussion, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks very much, and for those who are going to spring break, and hopefully to Cancun or Jamaica or Bermuda, have a nice time. For those who are staying here, enjoy yourselves. Thanks. Take care.
So my job here is to start off with a few questions to get the discussion started, and then turn it over to you to interact with Parag and talk about his book and other things. I get the sense that if we had one more double Hoya up here, there'd be spontaneous combustion.
Yeah.
There are too many Georgetown degrees in one place. Some of you may have had the thought when you saw this announcement that, wow, I've read his books, I've seen his TED Talks, I had no idea that he was an SSP grad, and not everybody here is in SSP, but security studies or the broader MSFS has significant folks all over the place, and Parag is one example of the kind of really great thinkers that these programs have produced. So what I thought I would do is get him to tell us a little bit about his background. His career is unique in certainly any grad that I'm aware of from these programs, but even more broadly, and to get a sense of how he got to that and how he maintains it, and then talk about the book a little bit, just in a few minutes, and then, as we're talking, obviously think about questions that you'd like to ask. So, first question, so looking at your bio, born in India, grew up in UAE, New York, and Germany. How was that? What were your parents up to that you were a world traveler even at a young age?
I guess I didn't get too much chance to think about it while it was happening, and I certainly wasn't in the driver's seat as a kid. But let me first say thank you all for being here and sacrificing a few hours of what will eventually become your spring break. It's very nostalgic for me because this is my 20th undergrad reunion and would be 15th or 14th SSP reunion. And Mike was a professor of mine. And I just saw Dan Nexon go up the stairs, who I took a class with when I was in the government department in the graduate program. So my roots here are very, very deep. So it's always a special experience. And in terms of my other roots, so my dad worked with Tata Enterprise, Tata Exports. So Tata today, it as owning Jaguar and Land Rover and being kind of a global Indian conglomerate, but it was much more run-of-the-mill stuff back then. So they sent him to East Africa, for example. So back in the post-colonial era, if you think about East Africa and the Middle East in the 50s and 60s, maybe let's say prior to the Lebanese Civil War, there were obviously Arab-Israeli wars and so forth. And there are definitely pockets where that part of the post-colonial world wasn't as terribly overpopulated and ridden with conflicts as it is right now. That was the period of nation building for many of these countries. And so India had long had colonial, post-colonial, and commercial linkages with these countries. In the 19th century, the British Empire circulated Indians all over, right, the former colonial world. That's why you have so many Indians in the Caribbean, for example. So we were just part of that typical wave. My brother was born in Sudan because my parents lived in Sudan for years. There are pictures that my parents have of being in Cairo and Beirut and Tripoli when those places were pre-Gaddafi and pre-Arab Spring and pre-overpopulation and Muslim Brotherhood and so forth. I mean, perfectly lovely places to be as an expat from whatever part of the world you came from. And then eventually made it to the US, and I was an exchange student in Germany, and I have an abitur from a German high school. And it was from there that I came to my freshman year here in Georgetown. The rest is history, with just one footnote that kind of the defining, and I was telling President DeJoya this earlier, he was my philosophy professor when I was a sophomore, so before he went into administration of the university and kind of reflecting and reminiscing with him. But my first sort of, once we became American in a way, my kind of adolescent years, then I went to Germany, but that was very German. It wasn't diverse. And the first experience for me in terms of the incredible geographic and cultural diversity that you can experience in one place was my freshman year here, and so that was definitely one very important stepping stone for me in thinking globally. But even before that, going back to Germany, was when the Berlin Wall fell and I was in 8th grade. The first thing my parents did, we were in New York at this point, was to get me and my brother, and within a couple of weeks of that moment, November 9th, we got on a plane and went to Berlin. And so I sat on the Berlin Wall. There was still lots of it left, and hacked away at the pieces myself and everything. And everything that I've done in my life is kind of just like a footnote to that moment, being 12 years old and going to Berlin. And it was at that moment where, if my college tour had begun as a 12-year-old, and deciding where I wanted to go to school, I would have chosen Georgetown as a 12-year-old. Just 4 years later is when I was like, definitely going to Georgetown.
Yeah. And you say that because you, even at that time, associated Georgetown as sort of a global university?
Well, in the sense that I was hooked on geopolitics, right? I was a Cold War junkie as a 12-year-old,
okay.
right? So, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. I was obviously slightly more aware, obviously, of sort of geopolitical events and circumstances. And remember, CNN came on stream in between. The Berlin Wall fell, it was NBC News, Tom Brokaw. Iraq War broke out in 1990, that was this first CNN war. 1991, Soviet Union collapsed, that was every television network in the world. And I was sequentially getting a little bit older, right? So started to get obviously completely hooked on these issues. So unlike a lot of people who kind of love everything and don't know what to major in, was not my problem. That was not a challenge I had. Like from the age of 12, it's like, I'm gonna do geopolitical stuff. Mm-hmm. And then when it comes time to choose where do you go to college, that became an open and shut case. And I imagine over the last 20 years, it's only become more and more obvious to high school students around the world that if you're going to study international affairs, this is one of the only places where you're really gonna get it done right.
Yeah. And having come, obviously, for both undergrad and then the security studies program, I guess, obviously, because you're back and the dean would not want you to say otherwise, but that was, it turned out to be, it seems like a very good choice in setting you up for what you wanted to do.
Yeah, and I think, it was in many ways continuity, right? Because even though there were 4 or 5 years in between, I went and worked in Europe and various think tanks and came back. But obviously most SSP students weren't Georgetown undergrads, but for me there was this very seamless continuity, even though there was a couple of years of break in between, because obviously the thematic content, I was a security studies major as an undergraduate even. Back then it was called Diplomacy and International Security. We called it DIPSEC, or Guns and Bombs. It was actually nicknamed Guns and Bombs. Do we still call it Guns and Bombs? There's no major that is nicknamed Guns and Bombs for undergrads. Oh, you're no fun anymore. But that's what we called it. So, for that, it was obviously such an obvious logical leap. And, for those who know their IR theory literature, my undergraduate mentor was Michael Brown, who then became director of SSP and subsequently moved to George Washington University, where he is now. So there was also the continuity there, because it was the same core advisor of mine was at SSP at the time.
Yeah, okay. And then when you leave here, for folks thinking sort of career-wise, you go off and do a PhD at London School of Economics.
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about, first of all, why, in your subsequent career, it seems like your insight, your traveling, your research wouldn't necessarily have required a PhD.
Right.
Why did you think at the time you needed one or wanted one?
That is a great question, because I think that around the time in the late 2000s when I was looking at the options, professionally coming out of SSP, there were a wide range of paths that one could have taken. So, for example, 2004 presidential election, where John Kerry was trying to unseat George W. Bush, I was at Brookings, and the whole 5th floor of Brookings was full of people who were, sort of ex-Clintonites who really wanted to get their jobs back after the disaster, of Bush's first term in the Iraq War. Put yourself in those shoes. And of course, John Kerry failed to unseat Bush. And so there was this, that would have been a path where, I never would have had time to do a PhD. I would have gone into a junior policy position somewhere in the government. It could have been the White House, State Department, whatever. So that didn't happen. Then I certainly thought, okay, well then I'll apply for PhD programs, and I did, and I got rejected from a whole bunch of them, including the government department at Georgetown, by the way. It's a very rigorous scholarly program. I was not up to scratch. But I pursued a third option, and this idea was hatched the day that John Kerry lost that election, which was to write a book. And so I wrote my first book proposal, and it stems directly, there's a cause and effect here. It was watching John Kerry lose and watching all of the very senior luminaries in foreign policy at Brookings realize that they're not going to get their old jobs back, at least for not for another 4 years, and saying to myself, well, I'm not going to wait, for my chance. But that doesn't mean that chance to be in policy is the only thing I'm ever going to do. So, I started writing my first book proposal that night. It was a book called The Second World, Empires Influence the New Global Order. It was very strongly based on the lessons of the Intro to Geopolitics class taught by the legendary Charles Purtle here back in the day. It's really one of the only pure geopolitics courses taught at the undergraduate level, probably anywhere in the world. I mean, factual statement, right? There must be 5 undergraduate classes on the planet Earth in pure geopolitical theory, and Purtle taught one of them, along with the legendary Map of the Modern World class, which was its sort of, one credit counterpart. So that has had such a massive influence on my life, like literally that one class and that one person. And I think there's basically, in a way, generational change in the School of Foreign Service alumni chronologies, like those who studied directly under Charles Purtle and those who came after. And you will have your own lore about undergrad SFS education today or graduate education today, but there was this figure, like Peter Dunkley, even almost at the same time with Western Civilization in his class, which you must have taken. No? Before, after?
Not as an undergrad, no.
Oh, okay. So anyway, well, there's a couple-year gap then.
Yeah.
But every era has its legends, and so in many ways, I would honestly say that a lot of my books and content in some of the books is still a reflection on and an attempt to grapple with the lessons of Purtle's geopolitics class from sophomore year here. You will never resolve questions that big, and Joel Hellman alluded to these big questions of world order and systemic transformation. There was enough in that one semester to last a lifetime. My next 12 books will still be in some way responding to or derivative of whatever I learned in that one semester. No joke. I talk about Purtle, the person, in my books, even though, of course, no one who didn't go to Georgetown would ever have heard of him. It has that kind of an impact. But anyway, so did that book and then said, I still thought, and this is the other transition I wanted to mention in answer to your question, is that there, historically, meaning, certainly the post-war decades, having a PhD was a critical, sort of signifier, price of admission to upper levels of national security policymaking. That's obviously not the case anymore. But back when I was coming out of SSP and applying to PhD programs, again, 15 years-ish ago, it still was, it was transitioning. You could still reach a certain level without a PhD, but there was obviously a sense that, better if you have it, So I thought about doing it, and I went back to it, obviously, and did it at LNC, with the notion in mind that I wasn't necessarily going to become an academic, become a professor, but certainly still important stamp certification for the policymaking world. Proved to no longer, be a necessary thing, but I'm obviously very glad I did it.
It's interesting. So one of the questions I was going to ask was about how this design of a career came out. I mean, for those of you that have been to Parag's website, I forget the exact phrase, but you're
I do stuff.
Strategist, world traveler, analyst, consultant. Back when you were at Brookings, did you, or even before, did you ever have a conception of, you're writing popular but in-depth books about significant global issues. traveling a great deal, working with a variety of companies and other organizations. Was that concept of a career ever coherently in your mind until it sort of happened?
Not at all, not at all. And I think, again, that's one of the other big shifts. And I wrote my second book, How to Run the World, was really about this diffusion of what constitutes diplomacy. Because diplomacy, especially obviously with its origins academically and in training in this school, is obviously pointed towards a path towards government. I'm sure that Georgetown still represents one of the two largest feeder schools to the Foreign Service and so forth. But what I wanted to write about was that there was obviously this literature in the 1990s around power shifts and non-state actors and so forth. And to me, that still constitutes diplomacy in some way. And the origins of diplomacy don't actually lie purely in state-to-state intergovernmental interactions. So I wanted to emphasize that, and then I realized in some ways I can start to practice what I'm preaching. But the experiences, they're very specific experiences that led me to design, as you say, but that is way too much predestination in that term. All of it is accidental. The sort of path, and one is that I guess in order, one would be going to work for a while at the World Economic Forum in Geneva, where rather than the pure policy think tank path where it's all domestically focused and public sector driven, that's a multi-stakeholder organization by its own design. So you start to get this interface with the corporate world and civil society and these kind of hybrid governance kinds of things that organization itself represents. So I moved to Geneva, worked there for a while, and so you get the sense that, wait a minute, there are all these people out there who are doing global issues and international affairs, but they're not doing it at Brookings or CFR, and I had just come out of CFR. So that's one. The other was writing the book, where I realized that, wait a minute, you can get a publisher to, finance your travel and research, and it's legitimate work because you're not doing it just sort of ad hoc, journalistically, you're not just a freelancer. There's a mission here, there's a product that comes out at the end, and even if I hadn't had an employer nominally, even if I hadn't been at Brookings or New America Foundation, which I moved to kind of midstream, even without a think tank hat on, there's a product coming out of this, and it's for the policy community, and it doesn't matter, you don't have to be sitting behind your think tank desk to produce this book. So that was the second experience, and that obviously I traveled to 40 plus countries over a 2.5 year period, obviously life-altering experience, entirely on my own, entirely me in like a backpack and a wheelie bag, and it was, I organized, no one helped me, like 0 people, I couldn't afford a research assistant or anything. I stretched my book advance out for a couple of years, right? And I did not have a home. Put everything in my parents' attic, and I barely was in this country, right, for a couple of years. And yet, it felt like there was a very significant umbrella under me. It wasn't Brookings anymore, and it was New America, but I barely ever even set foot there. But it was like, wait a minute, Random House, the publisher, and this is going to go on the market. So that also was a totally different experience than a typical path. And the third was working in the military, right? So when my first job out of Georgetown, you'll be pleased to know if you're an undergrad here and you're a senior, you can graduate without a job and it'll still be okay, because I was so keen on not, and remember the late 90s was a period where finance was everything. I would say the majority of my class went to work for an investment bank or McKinsey. And I have to say, I stuck to my guns. I was like, again, since I was 12 years old, I knew what I wanted to do, and working for Goldman Sachs was not what I wanted to do. I wanted to work at the Council on Foreign Relations. And the Council on Foreign Relations main, building is in New York, and my parents live in New York, and I wanted to be in New York, and I got, that's where Foreign Affairs is published, and of course, as a dorky, SFS kid that I was, always reading Foreign Affairs, and so I was like, I have to work there. And guess what? I didn't get a job there until like a few months after graduation. And I interviewed, and they only hire 5, 6, 7 RAs a year. So I actually went back, and I see my good friend Rohan here in the room. I went back to becoming a tennis bum. I moved to New York, back to New York, and I was coaching kids tennis. And my parents were like, wait a minute, we just paid how much for you to go to the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown? I was like, Mom, Dad, there's only one place I want to work, and it's the Council on Foreign Relations. But I'm bringing all this up because that wasn't the main thing, because that's very conventional, actually. Going to a think tank is very normal. It's what happened there. What happened there was that I was assigned to work with the visiting Army fellow, because they always have a fellow from the military services every year. That fellow happened to be Stan McChrystal. Stan McChrystal was a colonel at the time, not known to anyone outside the military, but now we all know who Stan McChrystal became and is. Great man and leader that he is. And so, just when I was finishing the book, some years later, I got an email saying, would you like to come work for me? So this is going back to what I said was the third service, which is the military. So I went and embedded with him in Iraq and Afghanistan and his team in special ops, and got to have some pretty, hair-raising experiences during the surge, no less. So this was splitting, going back and forth between Iraq and Afghanistan. So these couple of things, like working for a global organization rather than just a domestic focused think tank, writing a book, and doing my military thing, these are all unconventional. And so after you've done all three, you say to yourself, maybe there isn't just one prescribed path or normal way to be a policy person, right? Maybe you can just kind of do it your own way.
Yeah.
And so again, no design whatsoever.
Yeah. It's so interesting because, I think it's illustrative of the fact that early on we tend to think of we're going to make a bunch of choices along a path to some end. And along, a certain point along the way, you look back and realize there's a lot of semi-random branches and sequels that lead you in places that you don't necessarily assume, and it's how it's going to work out. So it's a different concept in advance of how to think.
But you should accept everything as fate in a way, there it is in that sense.
Yeah, right. All right, let's talk the futurization a little bit, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. So you lay out the general argument of the book, but one of the leading ideas is this significance of this unified view of Eurasia that is broader than, and as you have talked about in other interviews, you have a notion of the term Asia that is different than probably the standard term, the scope of the region that people would think about. So tell us a little bit about, what do you mean by Asia?
Yeah.
Why is a unified view important?
It's a great question, a great point of departure, and this is certainly one of the reasons I wrote the book. And this is hybridizing a bit geography, geopolitics, economics, and so forth. But when you study Asia geographically in a neutral way, not in a sort of what is the current foreign policy priority du jour sort of way, you realize, wait a minute, Asia is much, much broader, right? Asia is Saudi Arabia and Yemen, the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, all the way to the Sea of Japan. That's the proper geographic definition of Asia. And yet the last couple of decades, books about Asia have been books about China. So to me, there was obviously a big gaping hole there. And secondly, from a historical standpoint, Asia is a diverse array of rich civilizations that are actually, culturally mutually unintelligible. It's not all, the history of Asia is not whether China is powerful or not powerful. It's a lot more complex a story than that. Again, a story that's not well reflected through the very narrow, live-in-the-moment kind of prism in which everything is China, China, China. So the third motivation was also saying, well, let's look ahead a little bit, and what you find is that, well, how did China get to be China? Because in terms of the modern power that it has a lot to do with the predecessors like Japan and the tiger economies that invested in China and helped it grow. And then there's a next wave of growth that's happening right now, like India and Southeast Asian countries that are growing as fast or faster than China. India's population is soon to be larger than China's. They're getting more foreign investment than China is. So there is a future beyond, or there's future more. The further you look in the future, the more Asia is more than just China, right? So all of those stories needed to be kind of fused together in a way. So if you look at the book, 40% of it is about China, right? But not 100% of it, right? And that's been a pretty massive gap, I think, in the literature. So I wanted to do justice to all of those themes and put it in a global context, because I one of the arguments that I've clung to since the beginning of writing at all is that the world is, the notions of rise and decline, are far too oversimplified in our literature around power transitions and so forth. The rise of Asia does not mean the decline of the West per se, right? We live in a multipolar world. There's something unique about this century that we're moving into, where we simultaneously have multiple strong American states, Western states and powers, and we have multiple strong Asian states and powers. We've never lived, name me the century in history, where you had great powers on every continent of the world simultaneously in a non-colonial, non-imperial kind of order. This is unique. So this is extremely important when people want to tell you that we live in a new Cold War or a G2 world, these reductionist, oversimplified, or even worse, that there has to be a number one. So, the number one, if it's not us, then therefore it must be China, for better or worse. That's not the way history works, and that's not the way the future is going to work. There isn't going to be a number one, right? And that's been, I don't think that's a belief of mine, that's a fact, that's an empirical fact, and it's not well represented in the IR literature. And whether you become a card-carrying academic or not, when there's an itch you want to scratch, when there's a fight that you need to just roll up your sleeves and get into, intellectual or otherwise, that is obviously a motivator. And when I saw all of these 4 or 5 gigantic holes and errors, I think, in our conventional conception of where things are, I just felt it had to be addressed.
Yeah. How do you see, in the process of the region as you see it emerging, as you say, kind of a default vision in the United States is the incredible rise of China, China's search for regional and then potentially at some point global hegemony, China's desire to put the region under its influence and obtain deference from other countries in the region. Mm-hmm. As you looked at the dynamics, how should we in the United States properly view the emerging relationship of China to the region? Is it one where if we don't throw our weight behind other countries, China will inevitably essentially dominate the region, or not?
And the answer is no, and this is what's so important, not only because of our legacy role there, which is still very powerful, but also because of these internal Asian dynamics that we have not properly educated ourselves about. And as I point out in the book, Asians, including China, have 4,000 years of history in dealing with each other, right? It's not their first time at the rodeo or the dance, right? So yes, obviously China today is different from 20th century Japan or the Mongol Empire or whatever historical analogy you want to use. Each situation is somewhat different. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. But even China at this peak of power that it's at, and let's be clear that there's a very strong case to be made that we're already at peak China in terms of decelerating economy, demographic plateau, massive mountain of debt, and so forth. But there are all of these other factors, in addition to the historical capacity that Asians have to manage China, to understand China, to shape China as much as China shapes it. And this might be, for the Washington mind, to the extent there is one, I mean, the most provocative sentence in the book may be, Asia shapes China as much as China shapes Asia. And we don't see it that way. For us, it's just a simple one-way street. China, whatever China wants, China gets. And yet what I see is someone who lives in the region and travels to all these countries on China's periphery, and what you learn in Map of the Modern World is China has 14 neighbors, and see the world from Beijing's point of view and see China from the point of view of those countries, and you would look very differently at it, because they have an ability, all on their own, with our help for sure in some cases, but not all, to frustrate China, to deny China. And this is also not only because of the historical knowledge, but also because of the modern realities of sovereignty, of democracy, all of the ways in which now what you're seeing with the Belt and Road Initiative and some of the backlash against it is that countries are very clever about re-regulating their economies to block certain Chinese investments. So, a country can say, sorry, no Huawei. Sorry, you can't buy our electricity grid. Or, sorry, we're not going to take on $60 billion of debt, we're going to reduce it substantially. Or, sorry, there's multiple vendors in this marketplace, we don't have to have a Chinese construction company do this railway or whatever, we're going to have someone else do it. Even the poorest countries in the world actually can say that to China. If this were a colonial world, and of course our literature is filled with these very trite Eurocentric colonial analogies. I mean, how many times have you heard the Belt and Road Initiative is just like the British East India Company? All the time, and that's so lame. And the worst is it's so wrong. It's so brutally wrong. Because Africans and Asians in the 17th and 18th centuries didn't get to say no to the rifles, bayonets, and whatever else that the French and the British brought with them, right? Today, even Myanmar, poor, underdeveloped, and heavily indebted Myanmar, heavily indebted to China, it has the ability to deny China certain things that it wants. And so we never look at the world from the bottom up, from the inside out, from the perspective of the little guy, the way we should. We're always looking at it through this oversimplified, reductionist, top-down, great power drives all, China rules the world type of attitude. And this is the ultimate irony, because for us, China is this sort of, superpower with a 1,000-year plan and always gets what it wants. But if I were in Beijing right now, I'd be pulling my hair out, actually. I'd be like, and we never get what we want. The Malaysians are ripping up the contracts, and the Burmese are canceling the debt, and the Pakistanis don't want our investment, and these countries are blocking Huawei, and so on, and so on, and so on. So obviously the truth is somewhere in between. But it is that in between that opens the door to thinking about the dynamics of diplomacy, where we, here, from the US point of view or European point of view, can still engage very, very meaningfully, rather than just sort of writing off Asia. We've come a long way in just the last 5 minutes in talking about this, from sort of China gets what it wants to the reality on the ground. And it's an exciting, very, very exciting and dynamic diplomatic reality.
Yeah, that we have to take seriously. So it is ironic, as you talk about that it occurs to me something we've been talking a little bit about, some of us in the last few weeks, that the United States just spent 16, 17, 18 years learning the limits of a big power's power, trying to enforce its will on small powers. And now we turn around to China and assume that they are going to have magical success in a lot of these contexts that we could never have as the United States. So why would we assume that they could as well?
Exactly.
Well, that's fascinating. So I'm going to stop there and turn you over to the guests for questions. Obviously, a fascinating background, really amazing career, and really great insights in this new book. So over to you. Questions? Go ahead. Call on, folks.
Sure, okay.
Undergrads get priority.
Okay, so I'm Arjun, and so the three trends that strike me, right? The rise of geoeconomics, multipolarity, and emerging technologies, right? So with all three of those, and of course in the context of an Asianized 21st century, what do you think grand strategy would look like?
Right. Oh, that's a great question. It doesn't get asked nearly enough. Is how genuinely do we engage in this much more multipolar, heterogeneous Asia? And I think that if you were to have to put a bumper sticker onto grand strategy, that's often what we try to do when we're trying to think in containment terms or whatever the case may be. But in an age where, of course, containment doesn't work, what would it be? And my phrasing would be that we should pursue a grand strategy promoting Eurasian multipolarity, right? And that's obviously the logical implication of what I've just been saying. And a grand strategy of Eurasian multipolarity would focus less on, sort of containing China per se, but on strengthening all of the other forces. And that includes, to some degree, helping them to push back where necessary. And diminishing any power's geoeconomic or geopolitical dominance, and that can be done in again, grand strategy is always a statement of principles and intent. Then you derive various doctrines and policies from that. So you would, and some of these policies may have historical echoes. And that's a good thing, but there are certainly things that you can clearly reverse engineer from that statement that we could do, should do, ought to do better or more of. And one would be obviously joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, right? Because you would be bringing about a certain economic liberalization that would help to reform economies and make them less susceptible to dominance by state-owned enterprises from China, for example, right? They would obviously reform in such a way that would make them more attractive to global capital markets so they could dilute Chinese financial dominance. That's one thing you would do. Another relates to Belt and Road and infrastructure finance more broadly. You wouldn't just pretend, as our administration seems to think, that Belt and Road is going to implode or fail just because of some of the backlash. And I'm the one who's citing I know every instance of anti-Chinese backlash, but I definitely don't think Belt and Road is going to fail. So there's something wrong in Mike Pence's head if he thinks that Belt and Road is going to fail. I've been writing about Belt and Road since before Belt and Road had a name. Again, my first book went off and backpacked through Central Asia. There's no doubt that infrastructure, Chinese-led infrastructure, is actually a great thing for many of these countries. It's what they most desperately need in the world, is for Belt and Road to succeed, and they want it to. Right? And it's going to continue no matter how many failures, no matter how many debt traps Laos or Sri Lanka fall into. Those, quite frankly, are not the linchpin of Belt and Road, right? The countries that really matter are benefiting from this voluminous infrastructure. So how do we not pretend to block that story, suppress that story, but shape and even get in on that story is what we should be doing. Is another pillar of this grand strategy. That's something the Europeans are starting to do because they are very good at infrastructure development and finance. We're not very good at it. So they have a whole Asia connectivity initiative now. It's a response to Belt and Road. Japan and India have their own version as well. All of this is part of what I call the infrastructure arms race. So, the second pillar of the strategy would be participate actively in this infrastructure arms race. Not because we're really good at building highways, because as anyone who's been on, the Beltway, probably knows we're not. But it's about all of the ways in which that infrastructure drives economic growth and reforms, and we can be a big part of that story. So there are a lot of things we could do to promote this grand strategy of Eurasian multipolarity, and those are just two examples. I haven't heard that conversation in this town, right? I haven't heard, right now it's all new Cold War, and as we were saying before, it's like, okay, but now what, right? We're still at that sort of now what, deer in the headlights phase. And I think that's really sad given how much money is spent on so-called strategy. At least Mike runs a whole program at RAND around this that's properly analyzing the international environment. So you want to start with the assessment and the analysis. You want to get that right. I think there are parts of the establishment, like you guys, that have that part right. But now, how do you translate that into a strategy within administration? And that obviously involves forces beyond our control, like the electorate and elections and so forth. But at some point, we kind of want to get it right because the world's not going to wait forever for us to figure out what our new grand strategy is.
So you started already picking at the question I wanted to ask about the infrastructure arms race. To some extent, it seems very rivalrous in the way that there's the hypothetical Quad, the U.S. Build Act, IDFC, Chabahar with India, fiber optic contract deals in Papua New Guinea because of Australia. To what extent is the impact of these third-party countries in which both China and the U.S., Japan, India, whoever, are trying to compete with infrastructure development, finance? What kind of impact do you see with that?
Right. I think it's a good thing. So in infrastructure arms race, I use the terminology for two reasons. One, obviously it's provocative, and an arms race is galvanizing, and it's obviously it has a competitive overtone to it. However, an infrastructure arms race is the best kind of arms race. It's much better than a military arms race. I mean, Asia has military arms races going on as well. But an infrastructure arms race clearly benefits the host party by and large, provided that it's sensible infrastructure, which again, in most cases it is. It's one thing when we look at some Belt and Road project that's a boondoggle and we say, oh, what a waste, a port that Sri Lanka doesn't need. But that's the vast majority of Belt and Road projects are in useful transportation, but the other half of them are in energy. There's massive energy deficiencies all over. I mean, who could argue against an electricity grid for a country that doesn't have an electricity grid, right? So if you're against Belt and Road, you're against people having electricity is mostly what you would be saying. So the infrastructure arms race is mostly a good thing because we're saying, you know what? Now we're going to compete to provide affordable infrastructure services, transport, energy, communications, whatever it is, to all these countries. And rather than having to go with a Chinese vendor where the interest rate might be very high, might be non-concessional, now there's going to be a race to the bottom in a good way to make it the most affordable. So that's I think a good aspect of the arms race. So to me, this is actually a good thing because there's a $3 trillion annual deficit in infrastructure spending across Asia. Belt and Road at a maximum makes up a fraction of that actually. So everyone should be getting in this race. Europeans in particular, us as well. You can never have too many players in an infrastructure arms race when you think about the fact that the population of Asia is 4.5 billion people, most of whom live in poor, post-colonial countries, post-Soviet republics. We have a very long way to go. Sometimes we talk about Belt and Road as if it's done. It's barely begun. It's barely begun, right? I mean, look at the poverty, the lack of connectivity, the underdevelopment, the inequality, lack of diversification, the economies, at the same time the urbanization rates, the desire for connectivity, digital or otherwise, that is not yet met. A very, 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 very long way. Our lifetimes, can I just tell you, I can say with great certainty, the lifetime of every young person in this room will be, Eurasian connectivity is going to be a central story that you will still be telling your grandchildren about. That's how monumental this is. That's why it's the first page of this book.
Mm-hmm. Just a quick follow-up on that. How worried are you? As you know, the big narrative in Washington right now is the reason it's an arms race is because when China does those projects, they gain influence, they gain control. And this is part of their grand strategy to.
Right.
And you see a handful of examples in South Korea and elsewhere where they use their economic leverage to. How worried should we be about that, or do we routinely exaggerate the degree of control or influence China could get with these kind of infrastructure projects?
So it's a great question. And so two things. One, of course, threat inflation is a common problem in this town. Again, it's part of the sort of price of admission in the conversation. You have to say new Cold War, new Cold. But let me give a deeper answer. It's a very, very flawed assumption based on a misunderstanding of how infrastructure plays out. And the prequel to this book, Connectography, was 500 something pages exploring just this question, because infrastructure is a different category of good. It's not like a defense arms race where you lock a country into your technology and service provision and so forth, like with F-16s or something like that. You build a power plant for a country, you can't take it back, you can't expropriate it. Once you build it, they get to keep it, And the other thing is, generally speaking, it's a public good that more or less anyone can manage. If China builds you a power plant and then you decide that the Chinese company is trying to rip you off or extort you, you can kick them out and bring in a Turkish company to run the power plant, or better yet, run it yourself. Create some local jobs in the process. That's not true of all infrastructure. We can get into Huawei and so forth in a second. But by and large, this is, again, the traditional understanding, or the understanding that we have is not traditional at all, it's just wrong. That you build something, you own it. Not at all true. That's not the way history operates. The entire history of global empires, going back to the Roman Empire, through the Ottomans and the British, is building infrastructure to enhance your influence that you then give up when you lose your empire, right? India kept the railways, didn't it? Right? I mean, this should be so blindingly obvious to everyone, is that this is why actually when Xi Jinping uses the term gift, obviously we should be rightly suspicious and cynical in many, many, many ways about Belt and Road, but he doesn't even realize how right he is. Because they're blowing tons of their own money on stuff that they're not necessarily going to benefit from. They're already getting kicked out of countries, having deals ripped up and so on, that, it's some cost for them. I don't want to use Venezuela as an example, even though it's in the news, because not technically it's sort of like Belt and Road, but I have in the book stories around Ethiopia and other countries where China's financed stuff, built stuff, and running factories, but the locals don't like the partnership, and they ditch the Chinese and bring in Indians and other Asian contractors. So again, the China centricity is flawed because China has first mover advantage. But as in any business sector that you could look at, since when does first mover advantage connote or denote eternal dominance? It does in maybe a couple of areas. I mean, Google is obviously still the biggest search engine in the world, but in many other areas, you're certainly not guaranteed dominance, nor should you ever. You should certainly never be complacent about your dominance ever, because you have first mover advantage, and infrastructure is absolutely like that. And 5G I can sleep quite soundly at night, actually, knowing that even though Huawei has a 30% market share in in internet systems and so forth, the combination of the fact that the backlash against them because of data privacy and so forth, combined with now our encouraging countries to actually freeze them for a while, is awakening again. I said it already, the infrastructure arms race, suddenly Ericsson and Nokia are awake again and revived, and we're buying them time to strengthen their service offerings, and you will have a marketplace of services around 5G in a very short amount of time. And it'll be a very competitive global marketplace, and suddenly you'll find that you have significantly eroded that first mover advantage that Huawei has. And again, everything does work like that. That's why, again, I like I said, I sleep very soundly at night about this, because you can see this happening sector after. You can see this now with, Huawei and 5G is one example, but AI is another one. I mean, everyone is in this new Cold War paradigm. Again, it's sort of, it's either Baidu or Google, right? It's American AI or Chinese AI. Look at the VC industry. It's split down the middle between China and the US. But you know what? AI also is, like every other technology, rapidly diffusing. And why would you have China do your national AI this or that, when a couple of years from now there'll be an Indian company that was funded by Google or SoftBank? So you have Japanese or American funding going into an Indian company or a company from somewhere else that's going to offer the same service that China does, cost competitively, and you have no risk to your data at all. So we're already in that world, and the further you look in the future, which is to say next year or the year after, I mean practically tomorrow at the rate technology is diffusing, where you don't have to really worry about, again, and Eric Schmidt and others have said this, it's choice, America or China. No, you don't. The internet is not going to be split into an American internet and a Chinese internet. Even the greatest technological minds, and I think Eric Schmidt's a genius, but that doesn't mean he understands the geopolitics of this. It's great to fearmonger and so forth, but again, the law of technology diffusion is the most powerful law in the world. No one can control it. We can't, even North Korea can have nuclear weapons, right? Technology diffuses. Genie doesn't stay in the bottle. And that means it becomes a marketplace. And there's absolutely no reason for China to win in that marketplace, if you don't want it to, right? If you go out there and compete, and this is what I mean about get in the infrastructure arms race, whether it's 5G, AI, or electricity grids. And as soon as you turn something into a marketplace, you don't have a global monopoly.
Yeah. Questions?
You're showing or you're phrasing Asia in very broad terms. Europe has sort of struggles to find an identity, even though the territory is rather small. So what makes you suggest that this huge area has some sort of common theme, some commonality that will hold it together?
Plenty of reasons. I mean, again, no one alive today can remember the last era of the Silk Roads, right? We weren't born. Our great grandparents, still even they, because it was before the 16th century, right, that you had the last Silk Road era. But Asians, for most of their history, have had more to do with each other than with the rest of the world. Asia has got along fine for a few thousand years before Ferdinand Magellan rounded the Cape and before the Portuguese and the Spanish created the first global kind of economic system and created Europe's first global sort of colonial empires. So what makes me think that Asia can have certain bonds, even not a common identity, the yardstick of how Asia achieves a certain degree of common vision doesn't have to be a European measure. Europeans can do their thing, Asians will do their thing. And again, a big part of the book is denouncing actively Eurocentric analogies. You don't need Europe to explain Asia, you need Asia to explain Asia. 4,000 years of Asian history is the history of, even though Koreans and Indians and Thais and Mongols and Russians and Persians don't share a language, don't share a religion, still, they've managed to have these robust patterns, right? They're utterly mutually unintelligible civilizations that have managed to have, very robust relations over thousands of years. And that's what's come back again. And that story really was rekindled with the collapse of the Soviet Union, 1991. So we're 30 years into a process where Asians are again resurrecting those Silk Roads. It's been going on for 30 years. Belt and Road is just the newest chapter. You know, it's icing on the cake. It's been going. Asians already trade much more with each other. Add up China's trade with India, Japan, Korea, ASEAN, Australia. It's way more than our trade with us, right? We are China's, on a proper regional understanding, we're their third most important trading partner. We have much less leverage over them than we think we do, if you properly understand. So Asians can integrate, not the way Europeans have integrated. There will be no Asian Union, no Asian central bank, no Asian parliament, no Asian currency. You'll never have those things in Asia. But I never said they will. Never said they will. All I'm saying is that the new Silk Roads are back. There's plenty of historical precedent for it, despite all of the obstacles, cultural and geopolitical, all of the massive frictions between Asians who have been suspicious of each other, who have, major conflict formations: China, Japan, Taiwan, North Korea, India, Pakistan, India, China, South China Sea. Every major World War III scenario in the world is in Asia. But still, they're doing all of this, right? And all of this is actually a much bigger story than those specific conflicts, actually, because day to day, they've kept those things pretty separate. Now, things get very hot sometimes, like India and Pakistan right now, and Taiwan sometimes, and so forth, South China Sea. But one of our biggest errors, from our external point of view of Asia, is to define the region by the potential conflicts, rather than by the fact that those conflicts occupy 2% of their mind share, right? I'd actually put it at about 2%. Like 90% of what Asians do from 6 a.m. till 6 p.m. is figuring out actually how to trade with each other, how to actually liberalize their migration schemes with each other, which is something that they're doing, how to beg, borrow, steal, learn, trade, with each other, the diplomacy they have with each other, how to build institutions with each other. And 2% is, damn it, I still want the Paracel Islands, or Taiwan, you're coming back. That's 100% of our news coverage of them. It's 2% of what they spend their life on. Okay, let me be a bit more, let's say it's an 80-20 thing, even though it's a mixed metaphor. The bottom line is you've got to start seeing things from the inside out point of view, and it looks really different.
Interesting.
Viveka from Indian Chambers. Until a few years ago, we did not, in India, back home, there was no cognizance of jobless growth.
Right.
Now, thankfully, there is. But what do you think, what's the context of jobless growth in the future of Asia in general?
Right, that's a great question. So, by the way, you've come up with some questions I actually haven't heard in 6 whole weeks of book touring. So this is
it's Georgetown.
Yeah, I was going to say a real hat tip to Georgetown. Expected nothing less. So that's a great question. So economists call this premature deindustrialization, right? Informally jobless growth, which is, there are billions of people and not enough jobs because the robots are going to do it all, and this is obviously a problem. India is facing this problem for sure right now. The employment target of 3 or 4 million jobs a year can't be met if even the BPO, the outsourcing sector, has zero growth because of automation. So on the bright side, Asia's developing economies today are not the same economic profile of the tiger economies. And in the 70s and 80s, what helped Asian economies grow was obviously the outsourcing of manufactured labor, so large-scale, labor-intensive, manufacturing-driven, export-led growth was the growth model. But today, and I have an exact chart on this in the book, more than 50% of the GDP of most Asian countries, except for the just commodities-dependent countries, is in services. So they're not dependent just on manufacturing, right? They're getting all the manufacturing jobs that exist in the world. They're all going to Asia still. But it's not the majority of the jobs. It's now much more stuff related to services like can be anything from construction to hospitality to healthcare, education, logistics, e-commerce, technology. All of these things actually represents a much larger share of GDP and now jobs than manufacturing. But again, there's lots of manufacturing too. So jobless growth is therefore not a universal problem in Asia, right? So you go to Vietnam today, yeah, obviously poor people moving in from the countryside want to work in factory towns and so forth, but you've got cities like Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. Ho Chi Minh City has 20-something million people. Construction and all these sectors are booming. That's what people are doing. They're working in casinos, they're working in hotels, you know, and all they have to do is keep raising wages and training people in those sectors, and they're actually creating jobs. So most Asian countries, again, very hard to generalize, such economic disparity, but don't have an employment crisis right now. You know, in the Philippines, they have to raise wages for nurses and for elderly care and for construction to keep people in the country because they're off doing those services jobs in the Middle East, right? So like we need to build, everyone wants to do nation building in Asia right now. You can't do it without your own people. So they're raising wages in those areas. So jobless growth is not a universal problem. And so this is one of the dichotomies I make in the book kind of between us and Asians, because here everything is zero sum. It's e-commerce or it's retail, right? Everyone's buying from Amazon, so every mall shuts down. In Asia, you've got e-commerce growing and they're building lots of malls, because that's when you've got 4.5 billion people in fast-growing economies, you can have both and. Here it's AI or jobs, right? AI kills all the jobs, end of story, right? And a few really super smart people get jobs. Over there, AI like creates a lot of jobs, right? Kills some, like BPO, but it creates a lot as well. So they're in a sweet spot. I think, you know, it's not about optimism or pessimism. You know, I'm only an accidental optimist. I'm not sort of by design, by nature, an optimist. It's just that not every region, but regions of the world at a particular time, stars align, right? It could be, you know, Europe, back when Europe was young, right? You know, obviously rapid modernization, end of World War II, building welfare states and so forth. America also, interwar years, coming out of the Depression, world's largest economy, huge investment in infrastructure, interstate highway system and so forth. Why can't Asia have its moment where the stars align demographically, young populations, and in fact young populations helping to support the older populations, right? That's actually what's going on. That's why Korea and Japan are importing people from the rest of Asia. So they're in that demographic, industrial, sort of technological and global trade sweet spot right now. And they're going to enjoy that moment for the same amount of time that the United States enjoyed that moment and Europe enjoyed that moment. We don't have to look at it cynically. That's the part of the story that is literally just foreordained, because it's such a typical cycle. There's nothing even surprising about it.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, so I have a follow-up question on that. What do you make of the debate that's happening in India on lack of ability to create jobs as much as required, the demand and supply for job creation?
Right. So again, that boils down to not some kind of universal answer like, oh, it's never going to happen or it's impossible. It's about the smaller shifts, about sort of, you know, infrastructure investment creates a lot of jobs. India needs to do a lot more of it. Spending on education, hugely necessary, right? But not enough money going into it. So you can create those jobs, right? You just have to spend to create those jobs and spend on the right things. I mean, we talk about the mismatches in the labor force here, even though there's low unemployment in the United States right now. We need to spend so much more on education. Well, we should be raising wages in education, and then plenty of people would want to be teachers, right? So I don't think it's some kind of an existential issue where either you will succeed or you will fail. It's a policy issue across all these domains.
Other questions? Yeah.
I guess you sort of already talked about this in this century, Asia's rise being sort of preordained, but do you see any major challenges or stumbling blocks that could, you know, cause them either to drop the ball or have it delayed?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I think this is what's very, very interesting to forecast and prognosticate, you know, about, or scenarios that we should be thinking of. And the one that we haven't talked about yet is the environmental, right? I mean, this is a whole other phase of history in that sense as well, because there is no evidence that Asia can cope, collectively. Certainly not. Some countries will try, like China and others, to manage the environmental fallout and externalities of both global climate change and emissions that are baked into the system and their own kind of man-made ecological disasters. But most countries in Asia aren't doing nearly a good enough job of that. Certainly India isn't, and others, and they're vulnerable to, again, changes that are already baked in, rising sea levels, glacier melt, and so forth. So the combination of rising sea levels, flooding, drought, desertification, these phenomena affect many Asian countries in different ways. I read an article yesterday, I think it was called Iran's death by dehydration. So suicide by dehydration, right? Because the exploitation over harvesting of already very stressed water tables. There's no solution per se for Iran on that. That's 80 million people right there, and you have the same problem across multiple Asian countries. So without a doubt, this is not a knock on Asia per se, because the whole world has its own version of this. I mean, Brazil is, pillaging the rainforest, and we are still building coal-fired power plants, as is China, and so on. I think what it is an argument for why you should never make forecasts more than 5 years out. It's always funny to me when I get people forward to me on Twitter or by email all the time, sort of, here's like Ernst & Young or PwC's projection of the largest economies in the world by the year 2050. Don't you get those like every other day? I'm like, delete. It's like, don't tell me anything about the year 2050. Don't pretend you have a clue about the year 2050. Absolutely no one knows what the world's going to be like in the year 2050. Do you know that if you take not even an equivalent time span going in the other direction, so not, if that's 30 years from now, go back 30 years to 1990, the world population forecast was 15 billion people. Today, the world population forecast for 2050 is less than 10 billion people. That's a really massive margin of error, right? That's like a few standard deviations. That's like
in an area that you should be able to forecast much better than
you're supposed. We've got more than a few full-time demographers, right, on the payrolls of the World Bank and all this other stuff. Whoa, were they wrong, right? So we're going to be wrong about a lot of things, right? I mean, and it's always funny to see Nigeria pop up on this list, and I hate to be cruel, but Nigeria will extinguish itself. It will eat itself to death before it reaches a population of 350 million people, the way these things predict. There aren't resources for the country Nigeria to have 350 million people, right? It will literally never happen. So it's crazy when I see these kind of forecasts. I can give you 1,000 other examples of long-term forecasts gone awry. A smart way to do scenarios and to address these things is to think in 5-year increments. Say, where are we now? Where do we need to be in 5 years? What's the path to get there? Are we on that path? If not, let's reevaluate every year or two and keep changing, the measurement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good advice.
So one thing people haven't really mentioned too much is the Arctic Silk Road.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned environmental,
Yeah.
and now that that kind of route is opening up, and interest from Korea, Japan, Russia, the Nordic countries, what do you kind of see about that?
I think it's really interesting, and it's probably inevitable at this point that there'll be more and more Arctic transshipment. Big investments by Japan, Korea, and China in LNG tankers for the Arctic. A lot of Chinese and Russian development of Arctic gas fields and so forth. Definitely some experimentation with using it as a cargo route. Even now, fiber optic internet cables have been put down. So I think the Arctic's going to become, kind of a happening part of the world. I wrote a chapter of my last book on this. It was called Kirkenes, Capital of the Arctic. Kirkenes is a tiny town in Norway. So for my field work, I went to this village, and basically it's like one of the closest towns in the world to the North Pole, that's inhabited. and it's a boom town. You know, it's a mining town. It's very close to the Russian border. It's longitudinally where Istanbul is, because you know the Earth curves right up. So this part of eastern Norway is as far east as Istanbul, but it's one of the northernmost towns in the entire world, and the entire global population of the Arctic Circle is like less than 4 million people, and yet, according to a lot of forecasts around agricultural productivity in an era of warming, you know, of rising temperatures, a lot of our food production is going to come from Russia and Canada and in these places. So I went up there and I saw a town whose population is literally doubling like every other year, you know. And so if you can afford Norwegian real estate, like that's the place to be. So I think the Arctic will be interesting from a food standpoint, a logistics standpoint, trade, energy, in countless ways. It's going to be very, very interesting.
Sort of, Ben?
Digressing a little from the economic side, Asia is also concurrently experiencing some of the worst like humanitarian crises. And if you look at the Rohingyas, they say the world's largest refugee camp now is in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. And then you also have the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and I guess a lot of these are related to like effects of economic expansion. Sometimes, like the Uyghurs happen to be located in Xinjiang, which is one of the hubs of the BRI projects, and there are many other conflicts, humanitarian crises and conflicts going on. So what can you make out of this in the future?
It's a great question. I mean, I think, so it's hard to generalize about them, but one thing that Asia's ethno-religious, territorial conflicts have in common, obviously, is the, you know, legacy of borders, the imposition, I should say, of borders on top of civilizations or geographies that have traditionally had a lot more fluidity, right? So Asia as a whole is still grappling with where the borders are that they themselves did not place. And some of them date back to 19th century agreements between, you know, the British and the Russians, or just hasty exits like partition and so forth, and other kinds of things. But obviously, historically, Asian civilizations have been separated from each other much more by natural geography than by political geography. So the fact is that a lot of these issues are you know, related to putting a line somewhere where you probably shouldn't have a line at all, right? So that's part of it. And I think Asia is going to continue to grapple with that, and that's what obviously India-Pakistan is about, India-China is about that, and so on and so forth. So the legacy of decolonization and World War II unsettled kind of agreements, that's still baked into the system too much, and Asia is going to work through that basically one conflict at a time. Doesn't mean that there has to be conflict to resolve each of these situations, but that's why they are conflictual per se. And that gives rise to issues like, you know, multi-ethnic states that maybe shouldn't have been multi-ethnic states, or obviously the nature of statehood and sharing a state that leads to the power dynamics internally around majoritarianism and, you know, minority persecution of minorities and this kind of thing, which is also sometimes part and parcel of democratization. Obviously, there's a large literature on that, which some of you guys have hopefully read, around how democratization in very multi-ethnic, fragile states can be very polarizing, right? So that is also part of it. And then you just have sort of, you know, straight up civil wars like Yemen, you know, with a large international, you know, dimension as well, or you have state failure, post-colonial state failure, which is the Arab Spring. And those are now a whole swath of case studies in post-colonial state failure. So just by putting them into 5 or 6 buckets, you clearly see that, sure, there's lots of humanitarian crises in Asia, but they don't have the same explanation, obviously, and they obviously don't have the same solution. There are cases where I would advocate drawing new boundaries, shifting new borders, creating new states, and all this kind of stuff. And others where I would say that, you know, we need power sharing agreements and this kind of thing. You know, there isn't going to be one solution.
Well, we've got one more. I'm mindful of giving you time. There's books outside for those of you that didn't notice the setup. So I want to give everybody a few minutes before 4:30 to get a book and get it signed if they need to. But how about, there was one hand up here, Tonga?
I'd like to get your general assessment of U.S. strategy in Asia in light of the growing connectivity among the Asian countries and your future recommendations for the U.S. strategy on that?
Right, great question. Good place on. I think it goes back to the grand strategy question. Right now, we're doing things quite, piecemeal, right? I mean, we have an attempt at a Korea strategy. Obviously, there's some doubts about that after yesterday. A Japan strategy, a China strategy that's also kind of, a bit too held hostage to a few things. I mean, the relationship with China used to be seen, by which I mean relatively recent memory, is quite multidimensional, a strategic economic dialogue. And again, I would want to credit the RAND Corporation here for actually, mapping out a very broad agenda for U.S.-China relations and having recommendations in each of those areas. But today, you see this, again, new Cold War language, and that's the kind of language you use when you do not have a multidimensional relationship with another state, right? So I worry about that reductionism there. And, there's some notion of Pan-Asian strategy when you think about things like Indo-Pacific, right? So the shifting nomenclature around Pacific Command and desire to create more connective tissue between India and the other countries of the Quad arrangement, Japan, Australia, India, the relations we have with Vietnam and Indonesia, and the relations that India has with those countries as well, and Japan has with them almost bilaterally also. That's what I meant at the beginning about all of these kind of intra-Asian dynamics that are so exciting today. They're very shifting, and there's a part of the book where I kind of list some of these formations, and I'm like, it's like an Escher painting, right? I mean, you really can't find necessarily a logic to who's allying with whom on what and when and why, and it's shifting quite. But so our strategy can't be rigid if the environment is so fluid, right? That doesn't make sense. So I'm not saying that we should have, one Asia policy. That's the beauty of what grand strategy is supposed to be. It's supposed to be broad enough to accommodate change, and that's why I say a grand strategy of Eurasian multipolarity is more or less, in and of itself, something that one would think of as virtuous, irrespective of whatever shifts there are in the balance of power or other kinds of trends. So, I would like to see us take the best elements of our ad hoc policies towards specific countries and then build up to an actual Asia policy that is along the lines of what I was saying earlier in terms of our grand strategy. But, that's not where we are, sadly, right now. It is incumbent upon all of you, graduates of Georgetown, to enter the policy arena and try and, build up to that. But I'm not holding out any hope right now, I would say. We are clearly muddling through.
Yeah.
That's too bad.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the point where you started in terms of this is an unprecedented era in history, unprecedented for the United States to try to develop a strategy to, and something that's occurred to me a lot is, as the way you described it, the United States has sort of looked out at a more multipolar world when we were a lot more isolationist. We looked out at a bipolar or unipolar world when we were a lot more engaged.
Yeah.
We have never looked out at a multipolar world and been engaged and tried to lead it at the same time.
Yeah.
And that kind of nuance and coherence we're not very good at.
Right.
So one last thing I would stress before I ask you to join me in thanking Parag is the way he approaches these issues, I think, is very instructive for those of you that are still students and still kind of... In Washington, it is very easy in think tanks, but also in the intelligence community, in the State Department, in the Defense Department, to get behind a desk and observe the world through information that is coming to you through various channels. It's a very different approach to go out and spend a majority of your time on the ground in places talking to people to get that fingertip feel for what is happening in the world. There are all too few people who can bring that perspective back to those who are making policy. And the vast majority of those that policymakers rely on are people that are getting one or another version of some sort of filtered version of reality. I think Parag's a great example of the way to, no matter what you are doing, to discipline yourself in the kind of information you're getting and in the way you're approaching your problems to ensure that you are as in touch as possible with the real world as it is unfolding on the ground, rather than what you are getting through sort of more filtered channels. So for that, among other things, I thank him. And please join me in thanking him for this wonderful discussion.